It's time now for Focus. Today we have a report from northern Lebanon. The border with Syria has reopened, but Syrian refugees are staying put, and some locals aren't happy about that. Lebanon's president wants the international community to help refugees return to stable areas. Julie Dungelhoeff sent us this report.
Welcome to al-Assad, Syria. It's a message meant to be welcoming. Yet few travellers dare to cross the border again. We're in northern Lebanon, some 50 kilometres from Homs in Syria. The border crossing, which has been closed since 2011, reopened a month ago.
It's my first time crossing this border again. The road is very safe. It went smoothly. Everything went okay.
That day we saw no one crossing in the other direction, into Syria. Just last summer, there were still jihadists hiding in the mountains. They were only knocked out in August, trapped between the Lebanese army on one side and Hezbollah and the Syrian army on the other. 30,000 Syrians fled to Al-Kar. They wait here in these tents. Most arrived in 2011, at the height of the crisis. This family, though, resisted for as long as possible. They finally left Deir ez-Zor, an Islamic State group stronghold, a year ago. They were farmers there.
At first it was fine, but towards the end it became very difficult. We had no electricity or water. The Islamic State group began to crack down on us. They murdered a lot of people. We weren't allowed to smoke. We had to grow a beard. They throttled us from all sides. Here we have to collect water in the mountains. We have no water, no electricity. How can we live? Whatever the political situation in Syria, as soon as those jihadist dogs are gone, we will go home.
Ramadan sold his land to afford his life in exile. Because apart from daily chores, these Syrians don't have the right to work. Most live on less than €3 a day.
This is all we have. 2 foam mattresses. These are my children's clothes. And these are mine. We have nothing else. We left Syria empty-handed. We took nothing with us.
Suad fled with her husband and 2 children. The only members of her family that are still alive. The others were killed by jihadists. Despite living in a tent, she'd rather stay here, where she gets help from international organizations.
If it was safe, and if we still had our homes, we would want to go back. Why wouldn't we? We've been here 3 years and we're fed up. But we have nothing left in Syria. Our house was destroyed and half of our family killed. We can't go back.
In this small Christian town, the Syrians are unwelcome. The population has quadrupled to more than 40,000 people, but the infrastructure hasn't kept up. And the closure of the border for 6 years has taken its toll on the city's economy.
When the road was open, it was good. Everything was going well. But when the Syrians arrived, it went downhill. The economic situation here is catastrophic. I buy 10 bags of bread and I have to throw 4 of them away in the end. I also buy vegetables and throw a lot of them away. When the Syrians arrived in the region, they opened their own little shop.
Since the border reopened in mid-December, and with a majority of cities retaken from the Islamic State group, the villagers hope the Syrians will return home.
The Syrian regime's conditions for returning are complicated. People who have had no security problems can return. But if the Syrian authorities have the slightest doubt about a person or his family, if a person was injured, or if any of his family has been killed or wounded by the Islamic State group or Jabhat al-Nusra, or belongs to any opposition faction, they won't let them through. We would like them to go back to their country now, not later, because their presence here is a disaster both politically and demographically, and it jeopardizes us.
With the Syrians here, these Maronite Christians find themselves a minority in their own land. And the demons of the Lebanese civil war are resurging. The Red Cross says 80% of Syrian refugees in the region hope to return home.
For more on this, I'm now joined by Julie Dungelhoeff. She joins me from Beirut, and she is Care Communications Director for the Syria crisis. Hello, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Now, as I mentioned in the introduction to that report, Lebanon's President Michel Aoun wants Syrians to start heading back home to stable areas. Are there such areas near the border?
There are no stable areas inside Syria as we define them by international law. What we saw declared last year, the de-escalation zones by Russia, Turkey and Iran in 4 areas of Syria are currently active conflict areas. So in the north, Idlib, we saw 100,000 people internally displaced only in the month of January because there are airstrikes on a daily basis. Ghouta, another of these de-escalation zones, is currently besieged, has been besieged for years, and people have no access to aid. So we cannot talk about returning refugees unless we're talking about returning them on a voluntary basis, and it has to happen in dignity and safety.
So it's not only dangerous for them to return, perhaps, but also you mentioned they wouldn't necessarily have the aid that they need, the food and water they need. And also, as we heard in the report, the authorities could question their ties to jihadists.
Yes, so on one hand, the infrastructure in Syria has been heavily damaged by the fighting and the war. We're nearly hitting the 7th year anniversary. So the infrastructure is lacking. It needs reconstruction, will be a long-term process. And people who are going back are not necessarily being sent back to their area of origin. So imagine being displaced from your home and then being sent back to a different area. This is an issue. On the other hand, many Syrians who have been abroad for years fear, for example, forced conscription, being sent to the military to go fight. So people do not want to go back now, but every single Syrian refugee I've spoken to in Lebanon has told me that they definitely want to go back once the situation is stable and peace is back in Syria.
Would you say that's the case for refugees who've gone to other countries, such as Turkey and Jordan, that the great majority do want to go home in time?
Yes, people we speak to at CARE in Jordan and in Turkey have the same message. They don't want to be displaced. They don't want to live without any jobs, with limited access to education and healthcare. They want to go back. But for now, there is war, there is ongoing conflict in Syria, and the few cases of spontaneous returns we've seen were for family reunification purposes. Families have been, separated, and some people want to go back to find wives and husbands and sons and daughters. But the majority currently fear the situation in Syria.
So in the meantime, what can be done then to help the Lebanese authorities? Because I suppose it's understandable that they would say they're really struggling to cope with the influx. I mean, their population has gone up by about a quarter.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, whether it's Jordan, Turkey or Lebanon, these host countries have been facing the refugee influx for years now. And parallel to that, there should be an international response, a humanitarian response to help these countries face the challenges with infrastructure, with the environment, and even in the case of Lebanon, the social balance. But for now, the international community is still behind in terms of providing funding, and it's been the case for several years now. So unless the international community steps up, Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey and other neighboring countries which are hosting refugees will face increasing challenges.
All right, I'm afraid we've run out of time. Thank you very much, though, for yours. Julie Dungelhoeff, thank you very much for joining us from Beirut for today's Focus.